Here. You guys have a good couple days. Here.
welcome to week 13. Everyone, try to send 2 more classes after this one. So I think that's right, because the final week of the fall, we won't need week 13. Take home with me. So, right. Hope everyone's feeling any decent spirits. I know like the first snow or like whatever we call it, freezing, rainy snow, winter next. It always kind of takes me. Catches me off guard because was it last Thursday? It was 75 degrees. My daughter especially is just like, this can't be happening. What was unusual was last week. This is so on our agenda for this week, we're checking about your tasks for week 13. Our focus today will be on task-based language teaching, chapter 11, Washington, and then this sort of online education questions to look at. So checking into the things for week 13 include, like I mentioned, we have a video lecture on chapter 12, on some political considerations related to the world of consulting, specifically with public participants. 2 video answers fairly short, also on the participatory prototype. Your original annotations of them are due Saturday as usual and replies to Monday as usual. There are no more constructed language learning journal entries. You have hopefully submitted your final one. If you haven't submitted it, thank you. Just go ahead and do that. That means that term project basically ended at there is a quiz this week on chapters 11 and 12 and then starting next Tuesday, so as of like 12:01 a.m. on Tuesday, we'll be able to just have a look at that. You can even have a look at it before you come to class next week. So you can ask questions or just have a sort of framework around thinking about it. It's more like a writing assignment. Yeah, so it'll be basically asking you to kind of think about all that we've learned this semester and write basically about your eclectic approach as a teacher. Eclectic means sort of how will you take from all the things we've learned about language acquisition this semester and all these variety of methods and come up with a principled or good theory-based reasoned approach to teaching. So it'll be more of a writing assignment than it is like multiple. Not really that. You'll have 2 full weeks to work on it and then do Monday or Tuesday night. That's so that's the final one is kind of a heads up that'll be available next Tuesday morning. The rest is in for 4. Questions about any of that? Then our focus this week is on task-based language. Last week in our online asynchronous stuff that we did, we looked at contemporary communicative approaches, and we noticed that there's several methods that come out of that approach. We considered content-based instruction, and now we're looking at another of these communicative approaches known as task-based language. The key with TDLT is that sort of the most important principle behind it is the idea that we learn a language by using it, sometimes for another purpose. Like in our sort of pursuit of learning content, whether that's chemistry, biology, plumbing, whatever the content might be, we learn the language as we are learning academic or other kinds of content.
with task-based language teaching, it's very similar, but the idea is that we're trying to get something done, a task. For example, planning a trip itinerary. It has been very popular in what's known as English for specific purposes. So there's kind of a whole subgenre of TESL that is learning English for very specific purposes, usually job-related purposes. So business English is a big category of that, where there's a lot of people around the world and in this country who are very interested in improving their English skills, or specifically to use those skills in the business world. So there's also nursing English or healthcare English, English for hospitality, for people working in sort of hotels and restaurants, that kind of thing, airlines, etc. English for specific purposes, as you can imagine, there might be some very specific, say, vocabulary that you would need to have in those sort of genres of English for specific purposes. So if we're thinking about business English, what kinds of things do you think you would need to do with English in that sort of category?
Persuade.
Okay, persuade. Sure.
Again.
Not again. I think I brought my own. I tried to get back. So persuade, can you say a little bit more what you mean?
I convince people that what you're trying to sell is good.
Sales pitch, for example. Oh, good. What other kinds of things do you think you'll need to do with English?
I was thinking about all the formalities, the way that you have to write and speak.
Can you give a few examples, maybe?
I guess it's like letter writing, like how you introduce yourself as Mr. Madam, or when you end your letter, how you end it, if you say sincerely, or regards, or like what words are appropriate for what situation.
Yeah, great. So yeah, for example, I was on a Zoom call today with a applicant to our intensive English program in Mongolia. We're practicing for his visa interview. And at some point, he said to me something like, yeah, because he has a friend who would study in our program here. That's how he knows about it. And he said, so, she just told me about it. And I thought, I'm down. I thought it was so adorable. Number one, he's like, really, because he said it, and then he kind of looked at me like, did I use that phrase right? And I thought to myself, that's really lovely. He was trying out a little bit of like slang, seeing if it worked. But had he maybe been in a job interview for a business kind of position, and he said something like, I'm down, that might have been the wrong register, right? Or level of formality. So that's a good example of these kinds of things that in your written correspondence, or even just in spoken English, right? You might not say, I'm down for coming to your program. You might say, dear madam, whatever. Right. So things, especially written correspondence, even just email. What's appropriate in a business email versus, a WhatsApp or text message? It's different, right? Other examples of things in business English you might need to know or be able to do. How we use language in business kinds of settings.
Like vocabulary.
Yes, a lot of very specific vocabulary. I don't work in a corporate kind of job, but what could you, maybe some of you have before, what would you imagine some of that vocabulary to be? Okay, yeah, sure. Time, days, what else? That's exactly the word I was just thinking. Deliverable.
What is a deliberate?
A deliverable is what you get at the end of your production. So like if I was making a widget, my widget would be my deliverable.
So the end result?
The end result.
It could even be something like a report.
It could be a report.
advertising campaign.
Why don't they say that?
I know. It's crazy.
It means like, what's sort of the product
Yeah.
at the end of the process?
They barely say that word. They
Oh.
You're right.
Project management is even worse. It has its own rule.
Even that, yeah, so like it's kind of maybe the subcategory in business English project management. So for all of these things, for all of these parts of business English that a person might need to know and do, maybe writing the email or producing the advertising campaign, that might be a task, right? That might be a something you have to accomplish within, say, a job. Task-based language teaching is built around this idea that students don't necessarily just want to learn English for the purpose of kind of knowing words in English. They want to learn English to be able to write the business email. They want to learn English to write the report or come up with the ad campaign or manage the project. So that's a task. And we design language teaching around those sort of real life tasks so that students aren't just sort of learning grammar in a decontextualized way outside of a context, but the context of learning those maybe grammatical points or vocabulary items is the task that they're working toward. In this case, again, something within maybe the category of business, or, you know, like I said, healthcare English. The task might be like an intake kind of interview with a patient. The task might be, you know, wanting to understand why has this person come into the clinic. The task might be in, again, English for hospitality, checking someone into a hotel. These are all sort of tasks. What kind of language does the student need to be equipped with to be able to accomplish the task?
Specific purposes of this, ELL has to have more participation in order to be a part of a business only.
That's a good question. You probably can't start true beginners with a task-oriented. You probably need a very basic baseline of I don't know if that's actually true. I was going to say that we probably need a very basic baseline of kinds of interactions, but it could be. I kind of think, even if, say, let's assume for a second the task is even making a slice of toast or teaching someone to make a slice of toast. I think that might actually be a good sort of medium for teaching some very basic English around toast, like bread, toaster, and sort of doing a lot of demonstration around how to accomplish that task, through which the student then would gain a lot of vocabulary and probably like how to give commands or so all that to say, probably a very basic student couldn't start in a business English class, right? But yeah, the sort of concept or the model of task-based language teaching, I think, can be, in a sense, used at even the most basic level.
I would disagree.
Go ahead.
Because think of it this way. Accelerating and let's focus on build a business and I'm more efficient business English.
Yes.
So they'll still know the language for business, but that doesn't mean that they're not ready to learn. Like the customer, he's very efficient in business English.
Has a harder time with just conversational. Yeah. Well, and so that's why it kind of comes back to the student's purpose for learning. So for your cousin, if his primary purpose is to be using English in business settings, maybe that's okay. He's ill-equipped in other settings, right? That only becomes a problem when he's in those other settings. If those other settings become very important, well, then he's gonna need a different approach.
But like, once again, especially because most of the people he works with speak Spanish. So he runs into that situation when his boss is in English, but then in that profession, it's only centered around job. Like, you can get through the workday without knowing about
Right. So in that sense, maybe most of his needs are served that way. He just has a much more narrow range in terms of what he's able to do with English. I think it is possible that you could teach some very basic sort of beginner level, but the tasks themselves would have to be very simple, basically. Like I said, making toast or they would have to be very, very basic tasks around very familiar kinds of activities so that they would have touch points for in their own language for what they're doing, that they can sort of then slot in new vocabulary with direct meaning, basically. When it comes to task-based language teaching, it's very important that the tasks be meaningful, so that they be something that the students actually find as useful and valuable and that they want to accomplish. So again, the sort of idea of checking the client into the hotel or the patron into the hotel, that has to be something that that learner is committed to wanting to be able to do, or else it's not an especially meaningful task for them. They can't be just sort of random tasks that have no sort of salience or reason that the student would want to be able to do that. And they don't all have to be, the examples I've given are sort of job related. The task-based language teaching is frequently used in pre-K to 12th grade classrooms, and we'll see an example of that today. So they don't have to be job-related tasks, but they do have to be meaningful and measurable. So students have to be able to see that they achieved the task at the end, or not. Maybe they're not able to achieve the task, but if there doesn't seem to be an actual purpose and they can't tell at the end if they did the thing that they had hoped to be able to do, there's very little sort of motivation to accomplish the task, and therefore little language learning that happens. We talked last week about this idea of communicative approaches. Sometimes there's a strong communicative approach versus a weak communicative approach. In a strong version of a communicative approach, the language is acquired through real use of the language in trying to do something else. So again, in trying to accomplish a task or in trying to learn specific academic content. Very much this, it's very important, this idea that language acquisition happens through using language and not just sort of studying language as an object separate, like memorizing lists of information. Related to the idea of task-based language teaching that we read about, I think we read about it in Larson, Freeman, and Anderson, was the idea that there's kind of two syllabi that might be used in a language learning classroom. And not so much, when I say syllabi, it's not just sort of like the individual syllabus that you get for a given class, but more kind of the overall approach to curriculum. The first approach to thinking about how do we structure the topics that we might teach in a language classroom is called a synthetic syllabus. So in a synthetic syllabus, it's sort of made up of units of language. So for example, we're going to look at two different scope and sequences from two different ESL textbooks in a minute here, and think about which is synthetic and which is the other kind that I'll describe in a moment. But with synthetic, it's sort of broken down by language units. So maybe if it's grammar structures or vocabulary items, they're organized from more simple to more complex. And the learner sort of takes those language forms going from more simple to more complex. And the learner is sort of then responsible for synthesizing or kind of organizing how to apply that information to using language in for their own purposes, for communication. Grammar translation, audiolingual method, direct method, all used kind of synthetic syllabi, where, for example, you would start with simple present tense, for example, if we're thinking about verb tenses. We try and work on simple present, then we might add something like present progressive and looking at the difference. And then the learner would apply, when do I use simple present versus present progressive? Then we might start moving on to past tense verbs, how we use those. Different from a synthetic syllabus would be an analytic syllabus. In an analytic syllabus, we think of more focused on purposes for learning and using the language, not so much kind of the language forms themselves. So we would tend to see, for example, content-based instruction, task-based language teaching, the participatory approach that we'll look at later this week, are much more focused on how and why, in what situations is a person trying to use English. Let's organize how we're studying it around sort of purposes or functions for language. And then integrate the grammar, the vocabulary, the language forms that they'll need to accomplish those purposes. This I find kind of hard to explain and easier to see when kind of comparing them. So what I want us to do is, let's get in two groups. How many are we today? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So let's get in two groups of 4. On D2L, if at least one of you has a computer or tablet that you can look together, they're in the week, this is week 13. Yeah. In the week 13 folder, you'll find, I'll show it. Okay, so if you go into the week 13 folder, you'll find this submodule that says synthetic versus analytic syllabi. There are 2. These are 2 ESL, from 2 ESL textbooks, the scope and sequence. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say scope and sequence? This is kind of textbook language or curriculum language that at the beginning of a textbook, you'll typically find maybe across 2 pages or sometimes 4 or even more. It's basically like the table of contents, but it's intended to indicate, here's the sort of structure of units covered in this textbook, and all of the different, sort of the way that we're organizing information. So it's sort of like a table of contents, but with more information available for the teacher and the learner in terms of what is comprehensively sort of covered in this curriculum. Both of the ones we're looking at today, Focus on Grammar 1 and Ventures Level 1, are oriented towards beginner level students, sort of an A1. Not super beginner, that would be like an A0 in the Common European Framework of Reference, but A1, pretty low level beginner students. They're both focused on the same level, but they are oriented differently in terms of how they're approaching teaching those students. What I'd like you to do is meet with your group, look a little bit at these 2 scope and sequences, and based on sort of what I've told you about synthetic syllabus being organized by sort of language forms, And an analytic syllabus being focused or organized around what we do with language functions. Tell me which you think is which out of these two, okay? Which is organized more around forms of language and which is organized more around functions of language.
Like comparing the PDF.
Comparing these two PDFs, that's right. So open them up together, have a look together in two groups of 4, and then we'll talk a little bit about them.
Hello. Most programmers. It's a good one. So this is user and singular pronouns and plural pronouns. Plural pronouns. So this is what is it? Synthetic? Synthetic or so it's always more how words are to be. There's a description of the vocabulary, the rules that are using. To give an example of how to listen, speak, write, and tell their example. And then as we keep going, it introduces the same vocabulary, but in the past form. And we keep going, so forth. Now those ones analytic. So it's been limited to keywords that they're identify, say, unlike the other word.
So looking at these two, what's asking the question a different way to begin? Did you notice things that are similar between these two, or things that are quite the same? Here we have focus on grammar, it's scope and sequence. Here we have ventures, scope and sequence. What do you see similar words, similar things that are covered in these chapters? What do you think, Chase? That okay, so we see grammar in both, right? So even here, so this is the ventures one, maybe not in this welcome section, but as soon as we get to this first unit, you know, there's a whole heading, and in each unit here, we are seeing, oh, okay, we're working on possessive adjectives, subject pronouns, simple present, be, practice. It goes on. There's several grammar points in both, right? And this is not the focus on grammar textbook. If we go over to focus on grammar, we have a similar heading here in that first unit. And again, we're looking at specific sort of grammar forms. It's easier to see if you have it kind of in a like 2 pages next to each other, because for example, this is like the first page, and then if you keep scrolling down, this gives like what would have been kind of the opposite side of that. So in that same first unit, here's what we're doing with listening, here's what we're doing with speaking, writing, vocabulary.
Just about using that.
Those
The listening, speaking, writing.
right. So okay, so here we're in focus on grammar, but they are using all 4 skills. If I flip over, if I go back to ventures, okay, the things we're looking at: functions, listening and speaking, vocabulary, grammar, focus, and then hold on, scrolling down, reading, writing, life skills, pronunciation. So they're both dealing with kind of all of these skills necessary for communication. But in terms of how they're organized, how are these two different? Go ahead, Carolina.
So what you're different about the first one was just like we called it identity. But then we're just trying to introduce people things that fell into like the perspective of language where the other one was like why were they like what's the purpose of like doing all that basically what's to identify things and a perspective.
Okay, excellent. What would this group add in terms of what's different between the 2 syllables? So I
feel like the one that focus on grammar one edition, it is it's all about like, whereas the other one, there are a lot of things that need to happen, and it seems like everything's like built into like one. So it's like you scroll down the life skills indicator for me that this isn't just about grammar.
right. So I think both of what you said, Star and Faustina, if we are looking at this focus on grammar, you're right. It says it in the title. This is specifically a grammar textbook. And so it is organized around those language forms, grammatical forms. So in the first one, we're seeing that this is there are, we're seeing singular and plural nouns, proper nouns, a versus am, present tense of be, this, those, possessive adjectives. The units themselves are organized around grammatical forms. Then with those grammatical forms, we recognize in these sort of sections that they're going to do some reading as it relates to working on that grammar form. We're going to do some listening, speaking, writing, and vocabulary as it relates to that grammar form. But the scope and sequence, the curriculum is built around starting from more simple grammar forms and building to more complex grammar forms. Different from that is what we find over here in Ventures, where the units are built around more of these language functions. What's the purpose of the learner in learning the language? So they're starting at a probably pretty logical place of how do you talk about personal information and introductions. So the grammar, so the functions will include these things: identifying names, identifying numbers, using greetings, identifying countries of origin, exchanging personal information. Then there's some listening and speaking skills that you would need in doing those things. There's some vocabulary that you would need in talking about personal information. There's some grammar that you would find naturally sort of occurs when you're sharing personal information. There is some reading skills, writing skills, specifically life skills around pronunciation. So this is that same unit on personal information, and it's saying how the skill we're going to work on here is how to read a registration form. It's how to understand cultural differences in names, using personal titles, using a directory, reading an ID card. These are very real life kinds of skills for which a person would need to use English. So we're not just kind of not arbitrarily, but not starting from the grammar form, but we're starting from the function, from the what do we need to use English to do, and then integrating all of these language skills around that. Absolutely. So this kind of ideas of people with an approach like this, an analytic syllabus, because I hope you've identified at this point that the focus on grammar is the more synthetic one. I feel like those are weird words. What makes one synthetic and the other one analytic? I'm not really sure about that word choice, but I think maybe if we thought of it more in terms of organized by forms versus organized by functions. Forms of language, again, sort of verb tenses and other grammatical forms versus functions. What are we using language to do in life? This, the fourth unit deals with health, really with this assumption that if a person is, and Ventures is a widely used ESL textbook. It's used for years and years at the city colleges in their ESL program. I don't know if it still is presently, but it is widely used in sort of community ESL programs with the assumption that the target audience here are adult immigrants who need to learn English to survive and thrive in their new context of the United States. So it's really starting with this very basic kinds of functions of, at some point, you're going to have to talk to somebody about your health. And so when you go to describe your health problems and perhaps express sympathy or ask about someone's health, talk about body parts, health problems, etc., those are all language functions that a person's going to need to be able to do. How do we work in these skills of reading and writing, listening and speaking, vocabulary, grammar that are necessary to be able to do that function of using language around health? It often would be. It's good for a lot of kinds of things, but in a newcomer class, how can you imagine task-based language teaching happening, or what might be a task? Setting up your Ventra card, filling out the form at the doctor's office after child's school, etc. Yes, very much so. I think task-based language teaching really lends itself to a wide variety of tasks that we use language to accomplish. So I showed you these two different kinds of syllabi just as a sort of helpful way to maybe think through a lot of the sort of more classical methods that we've looked at, grammar translation method, audiolingual method, direct method, they were typically organized more around a synthetic syllabus, thinking kind of about the pieces of language, verb forms, vocabulary, organizing our language study around around language forms, and then the student is sort of then responsible for taking all the pieces of language, synthesizing them or putting them together to use language to accomplish their purposes. Some of the more contemporary communicative approaches, like content-based language teaching, task-based language teaching, the participatory approach, they're much more organized around language function. What does the learner want to be able to do with language? And then what grammar are they going to need to accomplish that? What vocabulary are they going to need to accomplish that? What are they going to need to be able to do with reading, writing, listening, and speaking to accomplish that function, the sort of task or thing that they want to do with language? So again, it's this idea that, and you can go back to this if you want. The idea is more built around the idea that language acquisition happens when we are using language to accomplish another purpose. Specific to task-based language teaching, then the process typically looks something like this. The teacher would announce sort of the purpose and the outcome, the task that we want to be able to accomplish in class or with our class, and why it's important, why it's meaningful for students. So we saw an example in chapter 11, that class was focused on putting together, creating a timetable of their, I think, classroom day. Then they go through a sort of pre-task phase where the class participates together in a task that they will later do individually, sort of like modeling the whole process together before then they accomplish a similar task individually or in small groups. It's very important that the students be sort of walked through the sort of the logical steps broken down step by step of the process so they can see kind of how it works and how you go from one step to the next to the next. So again, I think the example in chapter 11 was during the pre-task phase, they all worked together on developing a matrix of their schedule of the school day. And they all, the teacher, had them very much participate in, wait, what do we do at this time? What's before that? What's after that? And the students are all involved in talking through and creating that matrix. Teacher asks a lot of questions to verify that they understand. So communicating really clearly and asking those sort of probing questions to make sure they're not just sort of parroting what others around them are saying. And the teacher is, as walking through and leading this process, modeling the language that would typically be required to accomplish the task. So integrating a lot of the vocabulary that they'll need to use. If it involves a lot of question and answering, modeling how those questions would be posed and how their students can answer back. That's the sort of pre-class together. The same or very similar project that they're going to go through a process to accomplish next. Then, as they move on to the task portion, they work individually or maybe in pairs or small groups. The tasks should be designed to be highly interactive. So they might do something like a jigsaw exercise. Who knows what a jigsaw exercise is? When we think about language teaching, jigsaws. Strip sentences, like a strip story where everybody has a piece and they have to work together. That's a kind of jigsaw activity, yes. What else can I say about that? What's the word? Think of.
Word and soul.
Yeah, so that would be a sort of idea similar. When you think about like a jigsaw puzzle, right? There's a lot of different pieces and we're trying to put them together to make a picture. And usually with a jigsaw activity, different students have different pieces of information that they then have to work together to sort of solve the puzzle, essentially. So maybe I've seen it before where students had to work together to cook a recipe or even just write out a recipe. And some of them had some information about certain ingredients that have to be included. Other students had information about other ingredients, and they had to work together, kind of try to logically put it together, which ingredients you would add at what time. And in doing that, again, some of them have some information, others have other information, but they would have to work together to sort of complete the whole picture, which involves a lot of what we call in language teaching, negotiating for meaning. Negotiating for meaning. When we talk about negotiating for meaning, usually it involves one person having some information, another having other information, or just two people who are trying to communicate together, usually in a language that they don't share as first, and trying to use whatever language resources that they have to effectively communicate. And if there are breakdowns, trying a different way to come to understand it. It's similar to kind of what we've talked about in the past with repairing when there is a breakdown in communication, trying to say it a different way, or sometimes even demonstrating with your body, your facial expressions, pictures, until you come to a shared sense of understanding. As students are working together on the task, negotiating for meaning, it's really important that the teacher sort of be around to offer support as needed, but not sort of inserting his or herself into the process as much as possible, because the hope and the sort of design of this kind of approach to language teaching is that as much as possible, students are doing that negotiating for meaning. They're sort of struggling through, not with, you don't want them just flailing and we're like, can't understand each other and it's going terribly, but like using that opportunity where there are breakdowns in understanding to keep trying to find what language resources they have to come to understanding of meaning and accomplish the task together. So if the teacher is hearing errors or hearing things that are difficult, or ways that students started to break down in communication, but maybe were able to repair, they're noting that, because then in the post-task session, they can do a little bit more form-focused instruction, addressing the errors. I was hearing you ask questions, and I was hearing you say, can you able to do this? When we ask if someone is able to do something, there's two ways. Can you do this, or are you able to do this? But we don't say, can you able to? That's a common ELL instruction that is an error. You would save them for later, and you would not interrupt the task, the working together to accomplish the task, because the idea is that that interaction, that working together on the task, is where acquisition is happening. That it's not happening so much in the instruction portion of the language learning process, but it's really in when students are using language to try and sort through communication with the task being their goal. Not so much the language being their goal, but the task being their goal, and that the language acquisition happens almost as a what's the word I'm looking for? A side effect almost. That acquisition happens in that communication process, even when they're having a hard time. In the post-task, after the task is completed, we do some feedback to sort of assess the students' level of success with the task. Did they achieve the task or not? And that's really why it's important at the beginning that it be clear what the outcome should be, because that provides a lot of motivation. So if students have been given something like information on when maybe the task, maybe it's a group of students who are planning to travel to an English speaking place, and they wanted to do some sort of travel English preparation. Maybe we give them a train schedule from sort of one one city to another on the East Coast, and they have to figure out, okay, we have this information. Our task is to plan our itinerary. That's a pretty clear task. You have to plan an itinerary for travel over a certain number of days. It's motivating because it's relevant to the student's purpose. And it's also clear to them at the end, were they able to accomplish it or not? Were they able to put that itinerary together or not? In the post-test, there's also, that's a good time to address some of those errors that you were hearing or noticing in terms of breakdown of communication or just errors that students were making, and do a little bit more of focusing on those grammatical issues, elaborating on the grammar forms that they needed for the task and they didn't quite have enough of accuracy around the form to accomplish it. But again, that happens typically in the post-task. In the pre-task, we modeled some of that language, but we noticed what they were able to do with it during the task and can sort of focus in on forms in the post-task version of the portion of the lesson. Questions up to this point? Making sure the tasks are meaningful and that outcomes are clear is a really important part of task-based language teaching. So we'll look at a few ways that linguists and other thinkers have thought about this. An important person named Prabhu, he was one of the first people to write about task-based language teaching, and he identified sort of 3 types of tasks that are useful in the language teaching classroom. The first is, as we talked about a second ago, well, information gap, which jigsaw activities are a kind of information gap activity. So that's the idea that students have different bits of information that's required to accomplish the task, and they have to work together to share that information and negotiate to accomplish the task. The next is an opinion gap. That's where not so much facts or information, but students work together to gather perspectives or opinions. Like the example I think in chapter 11 again was they had to sort of poll their fellow students on what their favorite class was in school. A reasoning gap is more like what I described with the timetable or the train schedule activity, where students have some information that's given, but they have to do a more a process that involves inference or taking the information they have and drawing their own conclusions and synthesizing that information. It's a bit more cognitively demanding. It's not just sort of rote memorization of information, but they have to take that and then accomplish a task that involves inference. Ellis, another thinker, developed a few different kinds of tasks that he categorized into either unfocused tasks or focused tasks based on sort of grammatical forms. So you might have some tasks that don't necessarily require the use of a specific grammar form or linguistic structure, but others that you do. So for example, with a focused task, you intend for students to use a specific piece of grammar in being able to do it. So perhaps it's taking students on a field trip, and the task is that they have to maybe work together to write up some kind of report on what they did on the field trip. But since the field trip happened in the past, you really intentionally want them to be using past tense grammar structures, verbs in the past tense to write about things that they saw or did in the past. That would be a focused task where you are thinking about the kinds of language forms you want them to use in accomplishing the task. With unfocused, you just want them to use whatever language they have available to them to accomplish the task. Ellis also said that tasks could be directional, meaning some are more input providing. These are tasks that involve more listening and reading, those receptive skills. Whereas output prompting tasks usually involve our productive skills, speaking and writing. The These ones tend to be sort of better for group-based tasks, although both of them can be group or individual. And also bi-directionally identified as involving both input and output. So let's watch a video that's a demonstration of task-based language teaching. And as we're watching, think about some of these principles that we talked about and sort of some of these pieces, and if you see them or not in this demonstration video.
Okay, so today we are going to do a task-based learning, which is going to be a economic of your city. But before we start with of your city, your task, your activity, we are going to have a little test. So you are all living in Istanbul, right? This is our hometown. Very important Istanbul, all of you. You know what is Istanbul? And what kind of parents? Not the city. Do you know something? This is communism. I'm just from America. I'm happy. No, you're happy. Why? That's so good. Why? You have some? What kind of problem? Do you have some problem? Okay, let's try to talk about one more time. Social housing. So what kind of social housing do we have? Why is that problem? Why is it a problem? Why? So they have jobs in Istanbul. So they have jobs in Atlanta. Even in Atlanta for us, not only for the year, right? So we have seen job opportunities. But now, yes. Yes, we do have it. Especially young kids and high school kids, they have this kind of stuff. You don't have it, but the students will struggle. But that's pollution is pollution. Can you define pollution to air pollution yet? Like yet water pollution? And this is a very serious problem because it leads to what? It's the cause of global warming. It's the cause of global warming. Noise, sound is very noisy. Yes. Why? Why is that noisy? Who makes the noise? Cars start to make a lot of noise. But how do you live in a flat? Some of you live in a flat and you have even one neighbor, which is a big problem with the box. So you live in a flat and you have neighbors who are noisy. So we have this problem. What do you think? Yeah. Multiple problem? We do have multiple problem. Since you know this problem, I will move on to another thing. Utopia. So, do you have any kind of utopia? Yes. It's a perfect city of our world. Utopia, yes. It's a perfect. Why is it perfect? What does it mean perfect? Your imagination may not. What I'm going to do is to ask you to create your utopian city. Do you remember we watched a movie called The Giver? So The Giver, that movie actually was based on utopian society. Because everything was good, everything was useful, even people were not allowed to use that drugs. Remember? There was no war, no poor people, everyone had a job, and they have equality, equal rights, right? So, they also have some problems, I know, but now we are not going to focus on the problems of Victoria City, but you are going to see the important. And how you're going to do this, I will give you a map. This is a map. It's all my page, it doesn't belong to Earth. It's no like Earth. It's from another planet. No, it's from Earth, but we don't have a such thing. No. And you are supposed to draw your city with a building. And you can take the fact paper, worksheet. You can have building, birds, beaches, hotels, schools, hotels, airports, stations, hospitals, and whatever you want, you can add to your city. So this is going to be your city. You can add whatever you want. This is your first task is going to be to create your city with the building. So you are going to draw on this map. And it's called that as well. And you are going to name your city here at the top. Name your city, be creative. And second task is going to be about writing the rules. You are going to write about governance. Are you going to have governance in your city or not? It all depends on you. Legal system, I want to have both, maybe you can have 5 goals for your city. And population, how many people are going to live in your city? The number of educational system, children go to school, or parents, they go to work, maybe they don't. Just living in their education. I'm going to have internet. Maybe 5 internet at the school, so maybe you can no internet. Or the customs, traditions of people living in the city. Are they going to see any holidays in the city? Maybe you're going to have more holidays than we have. It's all up there. So you have to write a separate page paper. We can use the back of the paper to write how your city works. And the final task is going to be meditation. Once we done the project, we'll come here and decide the city, and then we will decide which to take to the next. And the Sunday is going to come on back to the school. And now I will divide you into 3 or 4 groups, and you will start doing your task. And before that, I will also give you some samples. If you have samples, so number 1 is the map of Ethiopia. Ethiopia. And here you have the sample of the city. You can have a look at this one. I make it inspired, but exactly standard of that. Okay. You ready? Do you have any questions? No? Everything is clear? Yeah. Okay, let's see your imagination, how creative you are going to be. So this is going to be your city.
It's our utopia. It's like ours, but no air pollution, no evils.
What is the name of your city?
Utopia.
Dystopia. Okay. Yes, what are the rules in your city?
Our rules are we all have equality and anything except evil is accepted. Second, if someone fight or argue with each other, they will get punished. Yeah, there is no fighting. 3, we have play, trade, cars, disciples, etc. that works with both. one symbol.
Uh-huh.
Can I look? We don't have a system. Everybody is free. And our flag is like
You have a flag?
this time.
Infinity sign. That's very creative.
For our utopia, it's called planet. It's a city with peace and everything we want. And this city has everything we need, everything like that. Everyone in there tries to be nice to each other and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, things go very well in there.
Excellent.
Our rules are these. You can support each other. When you become 9, you will get your bicycle.
Excellent.
You should love your yogurt.
Yogurt.
Yeah, we
Uh-huh.
love yogurt in our country. We are healthy.
Uh-huh.
We have different kinds of festivals, like we have yogurt festival, flower festival. We also have something like rabbit festival because rabbits like yogurt and some people love them from much.
Okay.
So little animals, but big festivals like
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
our money is Japanese. It's like this.
Mm-hmm.
In our country, 7 million people live in here.
Yes.
There is buildings.
You have a beach, I can see.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So your kids, they go to school in your country. Excellent.
Mostly transportation, like walking,
Mm-hmm.
biking, and canoeing.
Mm-hmm. So people are cycling. Do you have canals? Excellent. That's very good. Wow. Yes.
And then we have holidays,
Mm-hmm.
like 3 day, full day, 4 day road.
Mm-hmm.
We don't like or working.
Okay, I think we'll stop it there. Presentation. What are your impressions? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then when we were together, I imagine that so they all got their own pieces together.
So it's a little bit of information gap and then also some amount of opinion gap because they had to sort of negotiate with each other. What seems to be the one group really felt like yogurt was an important part of their utopia. And rabbits, the rabbits like yogurt. Yeah, so those were some important pieces of tactics language teaching that we saw here. What are some others, or maybe some pieces you thought you would see and didn't see? Other yeah, they were able to articulate some important things. Which, yeah, that's kind of the idea of the utopia. It's a perfect society, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so I felt like her approach was maybe a little bit different than the way we read, the free task and in the way that it's presented in Anderson, the teacher really guides them through a process. So maybe she might have actually gone with them and thought about sort of guiding them through what do we want to put in ours. She did something a little different, which was talking through real life problems in their own city and saying, okay, so we have a lack of jobs, immigrants that we don't have enough jobs for, drugs, pollution, etc. And then sort of took that to say, now, based on these problems, what would you want to have in your utopian society to sort of avoid these social problems?
I saw that method, and I thought like what she was trying to do was first stuff like that. So she was touching already to see where they were at in their knowledge. And they have the information about that. So maybe they did, then maybe she was
Scaffold that more significantly. That's a great point. I think that she was doing a little bit of a checking their schema. What do they know in terms of background understanding of these kind of social issues in a city, and then kind of eliciting their contributions to get a sense of what do they know and what would they be able to do. Precisely, yeah. We didn't also see, and because she doesn't actually go on to do a sort of post-task session. What do you think that might have looked like if she had? What sort of things would she have done in the post-task? Rather, I mean, we saw them give presentations of their task or the product of the task. What might you have expected to see in something like the post-task? Offering feedback, maybe looking at specific language forms.
She's really positive and motivating during the whole process. So never stop anyone to correct them. I think like she was sort of like building on some of their comments, like, oh no, like getting them to talk a little bit more.
Trying to elicit more details, elicit more language from them. Yeah.
I think feel like maybe for the probably helping them kind of like clumping together a little bit more, or getting to talk more about the things we can talk about together, maybe come together and share all. So she's like, they're going to pick up on things that you're part of the process as well.
Developing a sort of process of how do we choose, what's our rubric or what are our requirements that we choose. Yeah. What do you think about this as a language teaching method? Taking an approach that focuses more on a task or an activity, something that students accomplish either individually or together. That being the focus, less so the focus being actually on the language. You're not in your head.
That's a great way to do it.
Yeah. Right, so it takes a lot of the focus off of being concerned about making mistakes, errors, not saying it right.
That sounds stupid, but that sounds stupid, all that.
So addressing some of those, in terms of addressing those aspects, factors, or anxiety around language, like take some of the focus off things. What kind of situations do you work well in, or maybe not?
Great for I've seen it already. So I know that it's a sort of like the stress from that. But it would be just a fun to perform because again that has to be there. And then you also have people collaborating with you, and that collaboration feels different.
We're working together, we all have this shared task. We're not so much worried about sounding silly or things. Working together with our collaborators. I think an important part too is that the task be meaningful. So I'm actually a little like, how much do these, high schoolers in Istanbul care about creating the utopian society? I don't know if that's an especially meaningful or motivating task for them. But yogurt, yeah, apparently that was giving very, very meaningful and important. So that's a key piece of it. Is if the task is meaningful and engaging and purposeful, and students will feel this real sense of accomplishment, having been able to accomplish the task. That's very motivating. That then motivates a lot of the communication that ultimately the acquisition of the task that we're working for.
One of the things that I was thinking was, one was to the social studies, assignment, and then language that kind of like became a part of the deal.
Right. Yeah, and I'm not sure actually the context of this, if this was it seems to me it was maybe like a private school that's taught with English as the medium, and that was social studies, but I could be wrong. That might have been English class within the context, and they just are more advanced group of students working with a task-based framework. But we're over time, so I apologize for that. I just realized. So have a look at it. As always, have a look at the task. For what to do, and the sort of second part of the week is on participatory approach, which has some similarities. And I will see you next week. Thank you.
Three number journals.
Are you pleased with how the project went in?
Nope.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Why? Yeah, okay.
I wish I would learn more.